Robert Frost beautifully says, before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was likely to give offense. We always build walls. We build walls and boundaries to demarcate for ourselves
the difference between what's mine and what's somebody else's. To demarcate my house from somebody else's, my community from somebody else's, my space from somebody else's. We're always building walls. And these walls are essential. They enable a sense of safety. They create a sense of identity. I don't only build walls to demarcate space. I also build walls to demarcate who I am. What's the difference between me and you? Sometimes in the most physical way. You know, we all remember the Seinfeld. You remember that guy who always was in his space? You know, like the guy, hello, how are you? You know, it was like, what we touch, what we don't, how do we say hello there? They're very, very important. We all have different senses of how to do this. And we build these walls, and we know that we might give offense, and we know that it makes a difference. But how do I stand in the world? I stand in the world with my boundaries. And the key objective is to be able to understand both for myself and for others who I am and how do I preserve who I am. Now, sometimes the way we build these walls is not just merely to separate, to mark, to demarcate, but it's also to exclude. There are times when what that stands for and what that embodies is something that I in no way want to have as part of my life. In the Jewish tradition, the category of tameh, impure, is a way of separating and saying, no, I don't even want to touch it. It's not only that I don't want to consider, I don't even want to touch it. It can't be in my house. It could in no way enter in anything to do with what it is that I care about and which I value. Now, in our tradition, the classic boundary, the most significant boundary that we erect is the boundary to idolatry. And idolatry, when you delve into the laws of idolatry, there's one small part of the law, or one element of the laws of idolatry have to do with worship, making sure that you do not perform or you do not behave in any way that will incorporate idolatry into your life. But in our response to idolatry, we go one step further. We don't only say you shouldn't act in an idolatrous manner. We also say anything associated with an idolater, not just idolatry, cannot be part of my life. And that's why our tradition posits that you can't dress like an idolater. You can't walk like an idolater. You can't build buildings like an idolatrous building. Even though there's nothing idolatrous about them. But if I want to create that boundary, it's critical that it's not simply when you reach that edge, but I want you to stop way beforehand. Because in no way can my life be mine. In no way could I be a Jew. Our tradition says anybody who embraces idolatry, it's as if they have rejected the whole Torah. And consequently, I don't want to look like them. I don't want to talk like that. I want to be so far away because the minute I'm not careful, who I am is lost. One of the classic examples of a contemporary use of these boundaries has nothing to do with idolatry. It's our response to Nazis, for example. All of a sudden, a certain way of marching, a certain way of saluting, a certain dress. Just that dress, black, doesn't mean the same for Jews anymore. It just doesn't. You could see people in North Korea marching a certain way, and they had no idea about, just doesn't matter. The minute I see it, that association, There's things that it's passage is just rejected. I have not. That's not my story. And we understand that. And it's actually an important part of our framing of our identities and of our creating a safe world in which we could survive and function. But one of the challenges that we face today is that we are erecting these type of boundaries not between us and them, not between clearly delineated outsiders. There's the insider and there's the outsider. Today, one of the great sociological challenges of many countries in the Western world, including the United States and Canada and including Israel, is that we are erecting and functioning in this way towards those who are between us and us. People who are within our society, and we are themifying them. One of the places that we see this is around the topic that we're going to be studying together. I had an interesting experience, and I shared it with some of you about 8 months ago in the Bay Area. I was lecturing to a JCRC group, Jewish Community Relations Council group, who had studied with me, studied at the Institute, and we had a very deep, loving relationship with each other. Very, very deep. We connected very, very deeply. And the Institute is a group principally of Christian leaders for whom the Institute was a vehicle for understanding Israel, for understanding Judaism. The relationship was truly a loving relationship, as is only possible today in this new discourse between Jews and Christians. And I was on a panel, and a very, very serious friend of mine was interviewing me, a minister, and she asked me, she says, "Donniel, could you explain what does Zionism mean to you?" And I said to her straight out, I said, I am a nationalist. Now, I am a nationalist, but I'm not naive. And I knew that 2 weeks earlier, Donald Trump said that he was a nationalist. And I intentionally said, I am a nationalist, and we'll talk about that. And I spoke about how, as a Jew, it is a national context and structure which is so critical for me understanding who I am and the choices that I make, and my aspiration and vision for the future of Jewish life. Talking about Israel not as a default, not as the place that I was moved to by my parents, but as the place that I embrace as a desired expression. And in many ways in my own life, as a preferred expression for the fulfillment of my Judaism. And I'm talking and moving myself deeply. And that's enough, by the way. As a teacher, there has to be moments when that's dayenu. Like what it's like, it was sufficient. You have to get through the day. And she stops me and she says, "Donniel, I have to tell you, we love you." And she said a lot of nice things about me, which I'd love to share if I had more time. She says, "But Donniel, the minute you said you're a nationalist, you lost me." And she turned to the audience and said, "Who else felt the same?" 95% of the audience raised their hand. Says, "Donniel, what can we do?" And I thought for a moment, and I said, "Donald Trump plays golf." They were as perplexed as you are. Then I asked them, "Are you going to stop playing golf?" Now there was so you're going to stop playing golf? Is this the level of discourse that we're now going to have? Is anything, and again, I want you to be clear, this institute is deeply political but profoundly nonpartisan. Now, each one of us has political positions, but as an institute, this is not Democrat, Republican, Likud, Labor. There is no Labor anymore. Likud, blue and white. This is just not what we do. But is this the way we're going to conduct our intellectual discourse in our universe right now? And I said to them, I know you profoundly reject Donald Trump, but are you going to let him determine and define every one of your categories? Is who we are as people in the modern world going to be determined just like we did? Excuse me, if Donald Trump does that, well, I'm not doing that. Is that going to be the level of the discourse? Or are we going to fight to own our own categories? I said, you are making, in your rejection of Donald Trump, making him far more significant in being the determinant factor of your cultural life, of the categories that you use. Is that the way it's going to be? And whether it's nationalism, or whether it's Judaism, or whether it's identity, or whether it's Zionism, whatever it might be, there's always going to be somebody. Now, are they going to determine for you how you understand the categories? So I wanted to meet you before we started with a tefillah. You can be here for the next week and be the exact same person at the end that you are at the beginning. Now, normally, I really expect you to be the exact same person. But is your mind going to be exactly the same? Are you going to be open to a new idea? In this Beit Midrash, my tefillah is that you fight for the categories that are important to you and never allow somebody else to define them for you. That you engage in a learning process in which you allow yourselves to rethink every one of your presuppositions. Talmud Torah is significant in our tradition because it is one of the most disruptive ideas. The idea that to be a Jew means you have to learn. Why should you have to learn? I know, in one of my deepest fantasies, I really don't want you to learn. Just let me decide for you. I'll do it well, I promise. I'm a very thoughtful person. Soon my mother's going to be here. She'll vouch for me. She will. She really, really holds me in high regard. Notice I said my mother, not my wife. Talmud Torah is about you taking responsibility. But it's about you being willing to be on a journey. And so, let's have a journey together. Each one. Don't let anything close you down. Never judge an idea by who says it. And never judge what's possible because of the presuppositions within which you have come. Never limit your discourse because of the particular political party, ideology, sect, group, political correctness that you feel is essential. Talmud Torah is about freedom. Freedom to think and to reconstruct your world whenever it is that you, as autonomous, independent people, decide to do so. My bracha to you in our seminar, in this Beit Midrash, is that you be free. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to sit. I am Alana Stein-Hain. I'm the Director of Faculty and the Scholar in Residence at Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, and I am one of the architects of the content of this week of CLP. We are, as Donniel said to you, urged by the relevance of this topic. And part of what Donniel presented was the significance of categories being taken by one side of the spectrum politically or socially, or the other. To take it a step further, the reason why these categories are being taken by one side or the other is because there are such fundamental questions right now about nationalism versus globalism, about whether boundaries and borders are ethical at all, about the question of tribalism within broader collectives, And what we're here to do is to ask ourselves, how does the Jewish intellectual tradition respond to these kinds of big questions? What does this mean to us as citizens of the countries from which we come to this room? What does it mean for us as Jews, ethically? What are the ethics that we should be thinking about in this moment? And what does it mean for us as lovers of Israel and those who care about its future? And so over the course of this week, you could almost say that what we're going to be doing is a referendum on the idea of nationalism through Jewish sources. And what you'll notice is that there will be a deep focus on the state of Israel, clearly. That's why we brought you here. There will also be a deep focus on American Jewry in this moment, because American Jewry is going through somewhat of perhaps a shift in terms of its relationship to the broader national story in America. I'd like to spend a few minutes with you looking at your schedule so that I can give you a sense of the arc, the educational arc of this week, okay? Now, as you're doing that, I just want to say that we have so many newcomers to CLP this year. If you are a newcomer to CLP, would you raise your hand, please? That is incredible. It is just incredible. Now, the old comers to CLP, would you raise your hands? Okay. Now, this is going to be a lot of fun because the newcomers are going to get to make whatever moves they want because they're new, and the old comers are going to be able to say, oh, I did that once, right? But you'll help each other, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. Basically, the way this works is the morning lecture, generally, that happens in this room is setting the topic for the day. Sometimes the morning lecture takes place at night. We just call that morning lecture at night. So you're going to hear a morning lecture at night in a few minutes from Donniel. But let's start with today. So this evening, Donniel is going to be presenting a topic that we called Nationalism, Dilemmas of the Encumbered Self. And essentially what he's going to be doing is talking to us about what the critiques of nationalism are right now. Really go through, and I have to tell you that our research teams have been working on this the entire year. We've really been reading article after article and discussing and collaborating and trying to give people a sense of what is it that is troubling people about nationalism right now. Tomorrow morning, we're going to take a step back from the realpolitik question of what's eating people about nationalism for Yehuda to take us into more, I would say, abstract rabbinic philosophical sources. True, there is a time and a place of those sources as well, but it's not the time and the place that we're interested in. We're interested in the philosophy that those sources offer, specifically about what we think the character of a Jewish collective enterprise, such as nationalism, but it didn't exist yet, a Jewish collective enterprise should be. What should our character be as a collective? Because part of our job here is not just to think about how do I respond to somebody's disrespect for nationalism, it's actually thinking deeply about the ethics of the kind of nationalism you want to build. As we continue and move to Thursday morning, actually, I want to bring one more morning session in the evening to your attention. Wednesday evening, Jews and Nationalism with Alexander Kay, Historical Perspectives. What he's going to be doing is, in some sense, taking what Yehuda spoke about in the morning and asking very pointed questions in the 19th century and the early 20th century when it came time to decide what the character of Jewish collectivity would be, and the word nationalism and the politics of nationalism come in. How does that actually interact with our questions about character when you're talking nation state? Not just collective character, but an actual functioning body politic. How does that get negotiated? The next morning on Thursday, I'm going to be teaching about minority narratives. Reason being, we can't talk about nationalism just from the perspective of the majority or those who are framing the nation. It's essential, whether we're talking about ourselves as the minority in someone else's larger story, or we're talking about ourselves as the majority, we need to be thinking about what are the stories that minorities tell themselves about what they're doing in that nation state. And how can understanding those minority narratives help us whether we're the minority or we're the majority? And again, we're flipping back from the very historically contextualized 19th century, 20th century debates, and I'm going to take you into the Talmud. Not because we need to know exactly what was going on in the 5th century, but because it gives us some philosophy to work with. We're going to move on to American Jewry on Friday morning with Michal, asking the question of, well, actually, hey, who exactly are American Jews today within the national tapestry of America? Are we a minority? Are we part of the majority? How does that impact the way Americans, and by the way, Jews all around the world, how does that impact the way we talk about any of this, right? How are we implicated? And so she's going to talk about the big bad phrase that nobody really knows what it means. They just say it, identity politics, but she's going to tell us what it means. She's actually going to go through it with us, which I think will be wonderful. I'm going to skip Shabbat for a second, and I'm going to move you to Monday. Jewish nationalism from the Declaration of Independence to the Israeli nation-state law. We're moving back to Israel, and we're going to talk about what exactly has happened in terms of the rise of what we might call ethno-nationalism in the state of Israel. And beautifully, we're actually going to hear a response to Donniel's presentation by Tehillah Friedman and Mohammad Darousha. Each of them, I don't want to say they're representing the religious Zionist and Arab Israeli populations exclusively, but each of them can give us a voice as to what are the responses in those communities to the nation-state law, so that we can get a sense on the ground of what's actually happening. Moving on to Tuesday, we're ending in a way that we haven't ended before, which is instead of ending with the Q&A from the front, actually I think one year we didn't end with the Q&A, we are ending with Tal Becker and Yossi Klein Halevi talking about challenges of contemporary Israeli nationalism. Now, I can't think of two better people poised to have that conversation in a way that somehow won't offend anybody, but also will be honest. It's really kind of unique. They both have that ability. So you might be asking yourselves, so what's everything in between all of those things you just pointed out to us? Everything in between all of those things I just pointed out to you is what's going to actually deepen all of these themes. Each day, instead of just being with a group of 180, 200 people sitting in a room and listening, even though there's a Q&A piece, each day you're going to have the opportunity to either sit in a breakout session with your homeroom of 20 to 25 people, your group, where you're going to be able to continue to deepen the conversation that was opened that morning through a topic that will have connective tissue. Each group, I have to tell you, we have an incredible faculty at the Shalom Hartman Institute, both of North America and here in Jerusalem. They have worked to ensure that there is a way that there is a connective tissue between what you hear in the morning to what they're going to say, but it feels that you're going a step further and a step deeper. And so that's what you're doing in your breakout sessions. You're learning a new topic that's also connected. This year, we also have two things that are new to continue the deepening of your learning. Number one, and I want to thank, is anybody here from the Avi Schaefer Fund group? The Avi Schaefer Fund, a few years ago, said to us, we want to bring a group of young professionals to CLP, to the Community Leadership Program. And we said to ourselves, okay, let's see what happens. And one of the things that happened is that the Avi Schaefer Fund participants said to us, we'd like more time speaking with the morning lecturer. We know you have an hour of presentation, half an hour of Q&A. We want more time. And we said, you know what? We hear you. It took us a few years to implement because that's the way change happens. We now have what we're calling the post-class dialogue. Every day after lunch, if you would like to come, you don't have to sign up. Anyone can come, as many or as few. If you want to continue the conversation with the morning lecturer, every day in this room after lunch. The second thing we're adding is electives, or our electives. Electives are designed to do two things. Number one, they're designed to give you choice. You're going to a room with your group assignment for your breakout sessions. You don't know who your teacher is, or we're trying to keep that from you so that you'll be surprised and excited. You don't know who else is in that room, although you've probably all told each other. The electives are something totally different. You got an email from Tova Sirkin a few months ago, or a month ago, telling you about the electives and asking you to sign up. The goal of the elective, these are two-part electives. The goal of the elective is to delve into an issue that is broadly construed related to identity, collectivity, questions of democracy and nationalism and ethics, but isn't necessarily a direct line from a morning lecture or a breakout session. It actually allows us to be a little bit more expansive with our minds. And the second thing it allows us to do is it allows us to get really close with text. Meaning, we've asked the people who are teaching electives, choose the texts that are meatiest, that are richest, not the 2 lines of the curated text, the 17 lines where you go through it and people learn it together and offer their opinions on it, and you give your take. And so if you haven't signed up for electives to this point, please do. In the courtyard, I guarantee you every single elective, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think I'm gonna say this, I personally had the opportunity to review every elective, every breakout session that is happening here. So first of all, you have complaints, come to me. But second of all, I can tell you blood, sweat, and tears here. People respect what we're doing here to the degree that our faculty sat in chavruta with each other to prepare for this. There is no last minute, this is months and months of preparation. And so please do sign up for your electives. There are a few other things that I want to mention, which is number 1, tonight we have a special treat. Who here has heard, I'm asking you so many questions, who here has heard Rachel Korazim teach? Special treat? Special treat. Rachel Korazim is going to do an ode to Amos Oz this evening, like you've never seen it before. And so something that Rachel can do that often does not come through in some of our text studies, Rachel brings to life the affective, the emotional, the experiential. She makes you remember things you heard as a child and things you wish you had heard as a child. And so tonight is going to be something very special. Another special piece. Bougie Herzog is coming. That's kind of interesting. Look at us. Turns out we know some people in this country. Look at that. So Bougie Herzog is going to come tomorrow afternoon, which I think will be a really interesting opportunity to both hear a conversation and ask some questions, maybe some hard questions. And then moving on to Sunday, you have the study tour day, the Tiyul day. Now we are going to have an actual introduction to Tiyul day on your schedules. It is actually listed differently than the way we're going to do it. We are going to do an introduction to the Tiyulim, to the trips, in here for everyone at the same time, because it's too many people to split up for a half an hour or 25 minutes, okay? There are a few other things to notice in this schedule. One thing to notice are conversational lunches. Conversational lunches are opportunities to speak with our Israeli staff to find out more about the programs that go on in Hartman, Israel. I have to tell you, these are some of the most idealistic people, sometimes Sisyphusian, pushing the boulder up the hill and letting it fall back down, and yet their optimism is remarkable. So I urge you to sign up. I think you can sign up in the courtyard. Tova, is that right? Sign up in the courtyard for that as well. Lastly, I think, unless somebody tells me that I missed something, lastly, we have, after lunch, at the same time as the post-class dialogues are happening, we have a few other options as well. So if you look with me at Wednesday, tomorrow, you'll see that at the same time that the post-class dialogue is happening from 13:30 to 14:30, that is 1:30 to 2:30, for those who are not on Army time, Chaim Seidlerfeller, who was at UCLA Hillel for decades and is emeritus there, is going to be speaking about anti-Semitism on the college campus. Open to anyone, you don't have to sign up in advance. And later that day, Lauren Birkin is going to be offering soulful yoga and meditation in the Room of Many Hearts, something new over the last few years. The Room of Many Hearts, a place to sit, a place to meditate, a place to rest, a place to pray. You'll find it. We'll tell you where it is, okay? And if you look at, let's look at Thursday during the post-class dialogue, 13:30 to 14:30. Lauren is offering yoga during that time in the Room of Many Hearts. And Ronnie Yeager and Michal Guvrin are offering a really special window into a new ritual that they are part of creating for Yom HaShoah, for Holocaust Remembrance Day. And they're trying to give people a portal into what are renewal Judaism approaches right now, that is the renaissance of Judaism in Israel, to some of the really significant days on our calendar that may have lost some of their oomph, we might say. And so they want to share that. They want to share that with you. Moving on to one more, if you would. Monday, July 1st, during the post-class dialogue, again, 1:30 to 2:30 p.m., Zohar Atkins, a new faculty member of ours and a renowned poet, I can even say renowned at this point, Zohar. Ninveh, that's his new book of poetry. He's going to do a poetry reading and writing workshop where he's going to actually be reading some of his poems, but more significantly, he's actually going to be having you write some of your own and talking about what it means to write Jewish poetry. I think we've basically covered everything, except I clearly forgot that Micha Goodman is also giving a morning class, but it's in the afternoon on July 1st, and that Deborah Lipstadt is coming to talk about anti-Semitism with Yehuda Kurtzer, which I think is rather timely. And so if you get the sense of what we're trying to do here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to fill your minds and fill your hearts with challenging conversations that are informed by deep Jewish ideas, study, research, and actually to prompt people to reflect on things that usually just sort of get a tisk and a whimper, right? That usually are just causes of concern and worry. And what we're inviting you to do is we're actually inviting you to take all that concern and take all that worry and to actually channel it into productive learning, thought, and conversation. And I cannot emphasize enough, now that we have a more intergenerational, a more bi-coastal, a more international CLP experience, the opportunity to talk to people who you don't agree with is there in spades. And I hope that people find it. I want to open, before I close, to ask if anybody has any questions about anything I said or something I haven't said. Yeah, please. What's your name? Dorothy.
So there seems to be like a 2-hour break occasionally in the afternoon.
Yes.
I'm just curious how we expect to now
So during the 2-hour break in the afternoon, we just figured we wanted to give people, if they want to be able to spend time around Jerusalem, friends, relatives, sites, shopping, whatever it is, but you absolutely, this is your home away from home. You can absolutely spend time here during those 2 hours or any other time. Yes?
I'm embarrassed to ask this question.
Don't worry.
I don't know if I signed up for
You don't know if you signed up for the elective?
I remember thinking about them deeply.
So here's what you should do. You'll go to, first of all, that's amazing. I don't know if people heard that. He said, I remember thinking about the electives deeply, but I don't know if I signed up. Which, by the way, you're perfect for Hartman. Perfect. I really thought about it deeply, and my values have changed as a result, but I didn't RSVP. Welcome to Hartman. Very nice. So here's what you should do. You'll just go to the courtyard, see if your name is on one of those lists, and if not, put it on the list that you want. Who else? Other questions? Other questions? No? Okay, quick odds and ends. I know that the Temple Emmanuel group has egalitarian prayer services at 8 a.m. in Lafer 1, which you can find out where that is, on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday. Good? And everyone is invited. It's Temple Emmanuel wishes to host you at their services. And I also want to remind people that Friday night, you'll find out about this Friday morning, but Friday night we'll be having walking groups to various places if you want to go to pray. We'll have 3 or 4 walking groups led by a staff member. Okay, quick introduction of some of our staff. If you are a Hartman staff member, could you please raise your hand? Any of these people are here to help you. If you are a Hartman faculty member, please raise your hand. First of all, they are also staff. But second of all, they are here to help you too. And really, all of those people are here to not just help you, but talk to you. And not just, I have a concern, I have a complaint, but hey, that was really good. I really enjoyed that. Or, oof, that really went south. Whatever it is. And I want to introduce in particular the two masterminds behind making sure that this goes off so far without a hitch. Tova Sirkin, who is our director of North American programs in Israel. This is the second of 6 programs that she's running this summer, because the students started already yesterday. And Jordana Amzel, who is involved in development in our New York office, but will be coming here. So you will see her here. So I want to end the way that I always end, which is by quoting the prayer of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana is known for having had a certain prayer that he said when he walked into the Beit Midrash, into the study hall, and a prayer that he said when he left. And I always like to not just look at what's on the surface, but find out what I can compare it to. And so, as in any good rabbinic tradition, there are 2 different versions of the prayer that he said when he walked in. And so I'd like to share those versions with you now, and I think both are true to an extent in terms of what we need when we go into a place of study. The first is the Babylonian Talmud. He said, or he's quoted as saying, Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Elohai. May it be your will, God. Shelo ye'era davar takala al yadi. That I don't make any mistakes. Velo ekashel bidvar halacha. And I don't falter in a matter of law. But here comes the kicker. V'yismechu bi chaverai. And my friends will be happy at my faltering. Lest that happen. V'lo omar al tamei tahor, v'lo al tahor tamei. And I don't want to say about something that's impure that it's pure. And I don't want to say about something that's pure that it's impure. V'lo yikashlu chaverai b'dvar halacha ve'esmach bahem. And I don't want to laugh and be happy if my friends make mistakes either. And so the first version of this focuses on truth, and it focuses on what happens when we think we have the truth and somebody else falters in the truth. It's very tempting to laugh, and it's very tempting to be smug, but it feels bad when other people are doing it to us. And so he starts with the truth and moves to the ethics. In the Jerusalem Talmud, it goes in the reverse. We start with the ethics, and we move to the truth. Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Elohai v'Elohei avotai. May it be your will, God and God of my ancestors, shelo akpid keneged chaverai. That I won't get angry at my friends. V'lo chaverai yakpidu kinegdi. And my friends won't get angry at me. Shelo netamei et hatahor. That we not call things that are really pure, impure. V'lo netaher et hatamei. And we don't call things that are impure, pure. Shelo ne'asor et hamutar v'lo natir et ha'asur. That we don't allow things, that we don't forbid things that are allowed, and we don't allow things that are forbidden. V'nimtzeti mitbayesh l'olam hazeh u'l'olam haba. And then I would be forever ashamed in this world and in the next. In this version, we don't start with the truth. We don't start with, let's make sure we don't say about something that's pure that it's impure, and also let's make sure I don't make a mistake and somebody laughs at me. We start in the other direction. Let's make sure that we don't get angry at each other. Because if that's the focus, there's no way we're going to be able to declare pure what is pure and impure what is impure. Because we will be too busy worrying about who's angry at whom. There is a lot of contention around this topic. We know it, and that's why we chose it. But the fact that you chose to come here and learn about it and think about it means that for the people in this room, these prayers are as true as they ever were. And I would just say, so may it be. Thanks.
There is a time when we thought that in our world we can't imagine that there are no borders, and that the whole world will be one. And we thought that we as a world were moving in that direction. From a purely descriptive, as distinct from prescriptive sense, it is clear that our world is not moving in that direction. Nationalism is back. Nationalism is strong. And nationalist discourse is shaping much of political life. That is not to say that it ought to, even though it does pose a question, because if it is essential, is complaining about nationalism the same as complaining about rain? It's possible. Is it an essential perspective on the world which most suits human nature? But at least from our perspective today and in this seminar, we're not going to view it as an essential, necessary component. Our reflection, we know that it's back, but should it be back? We know that it's back, but should we combat it? The challenge is when we come to think about nationalism is that very often as we look around the world, some of the people who we disagree with most deeply, whether it be certain politicians in Israel or certain politicians in the United States, or certain politicians in Hungary or politicians in Austria or politicians in France or in England, or add the list longer and longer and longer. People who I in no way, when I look at their universe, I deeply reject the values that they stand for and do not feel that those values in any way speak to me. What happens when it is precisely that which I feel alienated from? They wrap it, carry it, found it on nationalist categories and principles. Does the fact that so many people who speak in the name of nationalism are people with whom not merely I don't want to have an association with, but who I do not value, what does it say about nationalism? Does it say something about nationalism, or does it say something about them? Is there a way to separate the categories? Or, if these are the people who use the category, maybe the category is fundamentally flawed. That's the subject that we're going to think about together over the next week. And the reason why we picked it is because, frankly, it's not of interest to me today to have a discourse about your relationship with Donald Trump. And whether you like Orban or not, doesn't keep me up at night. What does keep me up at night is that if Israel is the national home of the Jewish people, it's the nation state of the Jewish people, and if nationalism is perceived by ever-increasing numbers of thoughtful Jews and moral Jews to be something that is antithetical to their morality, antithetical to their values, antithetical to Judaism, then we have a profound challenge as a people. Or in fact, whether Jewish peoplehood is even possible anymore. I yearn for the time when the big issue facing Jewish life was whether Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal rabbis, there were no post-denominational at the time, could sit on the same panel together. I was so cutting edge when I was a young rabbi in New Jersey. I was just unbelievable. I actually sat down and I had a program in front of the whole JCC where I had an Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbi talking with each other. I was just so wicked. Truth be told, it made it a little more easy as I was the Orthodox rabbi. Why is that a joke? But in any event, I was the only Orthodox rabbi I could find, and the Reform rabbi was to the right of me on every issue. But regardless, but that was the point. But I remember the conversations. Should we have a shared kashrut? What should the JCC be kosher, and should the Jewish people? How do we live with each other despite our different kashrut policies, etc.? And part of what unified us was Israel. That it doesn't matter what shul you go to, and it doesn't matter what you eat. We could disagree about that, but there's something larger that calls us. There's something larger that all of us could belong to. And at the time, nobody ever thought to exclude somebody from an Israel Day parade. That was actually the thing we did together. I gave my bias from the outset. I am a nationalist. I am a Zionist. I love Israel and I love being in Israel. And I love the Jewish life that Israel affords me and allows me. But does that mean that I am becoming like Orban? Does that mean that somehow I am beginning to embody a moral universe that is at its core flawed? Now, when I said at the outset again that I was a nationalist and a Zionist, I obviously believe that that's not the case. But our job this week is not, despite my fantasies, for all of you to sign up to whatever it is that I personally, Donniel Hartman, believe, but to actually engage in thought about this question. If so many flawed people embrace nationalism, is it just an accident? Or is it something inherently flawed about nationalism? A softer possibility? Is there danger inherent within nationalism that allows it to be susceptible to such abuses? And therefore we have to understand those susceptibilities and combat them. Is nationalism inherently associated with fascism? Are all forms of nationalism the same? Ethnic nationalism, civic nationalism? Is globalism or individualism, are those better categories, more suited to the moral universe that we want to live in? We're going to think about those questions. But as we think about them, I want to go on a journey with you. And my remarks are intended to be, or to give expression to that journey. Not a journey which is going to answer. My goal this afternoon or this evening is to frame a conversation that I hope will accompany you through your thoughts on this process. Now, you didn't come here, or maybe most of you did not come here for a political science seminar. And I'm going to avoid the temptation of doing so. But I want to, just at the outset, put forth just two categories. So put on another hat for a moment and open to page 1. And let's just read two categories together. And the aim of these, let's define our terms. And the aim of defining our terms is just to enable a conversation. And I want to be really clear. These definitions come from tens and tens of definitions that are offered culled and combined together. Many of these categories can't be defined, in particular a category like fascism. There's a whole genre of intellectual thought trying to even figure what are the essential features. What are the 10, 15 features that make something fascism or not? But I want to just define the categories briefly. When I speak about nationalism, and when most of the people in the seminar will speak about nationalism, nationalism is a position which advocates for loyalty, devotion, identification. These are the terms. Loyalty, devotion, identification to or with one's own nation, and support for its interests. It doesn't define yet what constitutes that nation, what constitutes that core group. And if you've done some of the reading, you know that there's a deep, profound conversation as to what is the ideal structure around which a nation state is formed. Loyalty, devotion, and identification with one's own nation. And that loyalty, devotion, identification involves a support for its interests. And this is where it's critical, and we're going to talk about this more and more, including, and I choose this term very, very carefully, the prioritization of some of these interests of those of others. There is no nation state, there is no notion of being a nationalist unless there is some notion of prioritization. I know in America you have a debate about universal health care, but you do not have any debate in America about universal health care. There is no debate, regardless of what your political position is. There is not a single person, not a single ideology in North America, whether you're Democrat, Republican, far on the left, far on the right. There is not one position in the United States which advocates universal health care. And there's not one such position in any nation in the world. When you speak about universal health care in the United States, you speak about universal health care for Americans. Oh, universal health care is for whom? For everybody who lives within your nation. Nobody is getting up and saying in the United States, we have to advocate, everybody has to be under some health care. Anybody in the world? Please notice there's not a single political position advocated by any political theorist. There is a moral position which speaks about the fact that your moral responsibility after your most basic maintaining of your most basic need for food and shelter and clothing is to distribute all of your goods to whoever is most at need. But within political discourse, there is not one position which ever advocates the distributing of all of your resources equally to everybody within the universe. Just like universal conscription doesn't speak about drafting somebody else. When you use universal, it's in the context of a particular group, and nationalism speaks to the fact that you will prioritize. And you will spend money on infrastructure. Now, you will have international aid, but Rhode Island will spend more on new highways than almost any international aid package. And nationalism speaks to that part of your loyalty and devotion identification involves an issue of prioritization. Now we're going to come back to this because this is where nationalism begins to be asking us, is this uncomfortable? How do we deal with this issue of prioritization? But I'm just again pointing to the fact, and I'm going to express why I'm pointing out this fact, that is a self-evident part of all discourse, which transcends any of the partisanship which we think is so dominant in our conversation. It views the sovereign state as a morally legitimate and necessary political framework, wherein members or citizens distribute to each other goods and pursue, protect, and promulgate their identity, values, and culture. When we speak about nationalism, this is the core definition of the term. Doesn't mean all nationalism is good. Doesn't mean it can't be abused. But it is that sense of devotion and loyalty, looking out for the interests, even to including essentially their prioritization. There is a prioritization. And the viewing of the nation state as either legitimate or in many ways necessary, even ideal framework to pursue both your aspirations or the distribution of goods and to protect and spread your identity, your values, and your culture. This is a core definition of nationalism. Now, the nightmare of this definition is fascism. And I'm not going to go into, as I said, all the features. Does nationalism, is it a certain level of authoritarianism? Does it have xenophobia? Does it involve a certain economic perspective? Let's leave the graduate seminar of fascism alone. But just from the perspective of the nightmare of nationalism, I am offering one feature of fascism, which speaks about the embracing, and here I choose the word intentionally, the exalting, as distinct from prioritization. The exalting of one's nation, and very often one's race, but not only, doesn't have to be racial. Not all fascism is racism, but some levels of fascism are. Above all others, and legitimize the support of its interest to the exclusion and discrimination of all others. We all speak in terms of spectrum. What is the spectrum between prioritization and discrimination? And we're going to delve into that more deeply. And throughout the seminar, this is the question. This is the question about a relationship to Israel. This is about a question that Israelis, who is an Israeli, who is a Jew, who is a Canadian, who's a citizen of the United States, what does it mean? How do I deal with immigrations? What are the boundaries of that? Should I open myself up? Should I not? All of these. What's the difference between prioritization and discrimination, and where is the line drawn? But now I'd like to shift gears. This is so that we have the categories with which to talk to each other. I'd like to now essentially tell two different stories, two intellectual stories. Stories which shape the way I think about nationalism, stories which shape the way I personally come to think and address and struggle with this question. With the question of my loyalties, with the connection of my association with Israel, with the connection of my association with world Jewry, and my core identity of who I am. Now, I want to tell a story or weave together a narrative of the stories that I have learned from my tradition, because I believe profoundly, and here I was deeply impacted both by McIntyre and by Sandel, that we don't pick or attempt to decide and struggle about whether nationalism is good or bad. Do I want to be a nationalist or a globalist? Do I choose ethnic nationalism over civic nationalism? Or I'm an individualist but not a globalist? We don't pick our positions on the basis of some Kantian pure reason. We don't line them up like in a supermarket. And I'm coming to pick a ketchup or a mustard. Do I want Heinz or Hunt or Assis? Which one? Trying to ascertain which one is most healthy, looking at the ingredients and trying to ascertain what is the best ketchup. It's not the way we think about these questions. We don't come with a Rawlsian veil of ignorance in which we don't know who we are and we don't know what our good is, and we come to reflect on what is the ideal form which will maximize justice. That's not the way human beings do ethics. That's not the way we try to ascertain what's of value, and that is certainly not the way we do political thought. There is no view from nowhere. There's only a view from somewhere. And each one of us is shaped by those stories. And part of the way I want to model, but I also challenge you to think about in the same way, where do you come from? Where do you come from? And within the context of where you come from and the values that seem to be essential to your moral instincts, what are the consequences of that to thinking about nationalism and Jewish peoplehood? So I want to tell two stories. One story of what I've learned from my tradition, from growing up within the Jewish tradition. What did our tradition tell me about who I am and the way I am connected, and I'm going to use the term that the Jew or the individual is an encumbered being. As a being who is fundamentally in relationship and connected to others. And I want to talk about the story that I heard. You know how every Jew is supposed to tell the story of our exodus from Egypt. Well, I don't want to tell the story of the exodus. I want to tell the story from 10,000 feet high, the story of who, what does it mean to be both a being and a Jew, as told by our tradition. In doing so, I am not claiming its moral superiority. I'm merely declaring that this is my story. And it is a story that has a profound impact on me in shaping my thoughts on this subject. And the second story is a story about what is the value, the purpose, the fancy word, the telos, of the life of the Jewish people. What are we coming together as a people for? Who do we want to be? What do we value? And then asking, what does that story tell us? And how might it impact on how we think about this question of nationalism and this question about this loyalty, solidarity to a particular nation? And as you will see, that second story, and I'll repeat this again later, is a very complicated story with three different, competing, and I will argue complementary chapters to it. But let's start the story of humanity. Who am I? Genesis 1 tells me that I'm a single individual. I'm androgynous in some sense. Oh, one second, excuse me. There's one more caveat to these stories. And here, anyone, and this is a general rule both about this class, but it's a challenge that we face in general, is that much of the stories that our tradition tells about who we are very deeply male stories. It's a story about the male. It's a story about who this male is, and very often the relationship, and this, it doesn't fit a new story that we've embraced. And so even though the story is profoundly genderized in one position, with one perspective about who is the dominant gender and the relationship between what is both the family and relationships that we have, while telling this story, I am not buying into their gender presuppositions. And part of our challenge of anybody who goes back to any tradition written before the 19th century, because since the 19th century, everything's been great. Is that we need to be aware of it, we have to reflect on it, but being part of a tradition is how do we use it and transcend it and shape it within new stories and categories that we've come to understand. That's a perfect example, by the way, of while I'm telling a story, we're not prisoners to our stories. We could hear those stories, we're impacted on them, by them, and then at times we could also change them. And sometimes it's essential, and sometimes we choose not to. And so by talking about a story, I'm neither limiting the soul's narrative of Judaism, nor am I saying that there's any deterministic feature to this as essential to my identity, but merely important and critical to my understanding of myself. Genesis 1 tells of the creation of an androgynous being. Are they genderless? Do they have a dual gender? The essential feature is not their gender. Their essential feature is that they're created in the image of God. They're not in a relationship with anybody. Their relationship purely defined by the God who creates them, who challenges them to live on a mission, up to rule the world and master it. Genesis 1, Adam 1, or Adam and Eve 1, is essentially a being that conceptually afterwards our tradition will want to speak to and relate to, but that's not the being that any of us know. The story of humanity, as we know it, does not begin in Genesis 1, in a certain sense. It really begins in Genesis 2. And Genesis 2 tells of Adam being alone, and that aloneness being something that God wants to transcend. And the minute that aloneness is transcended, Adam enters into a relationship with Eve, and the first thing that we are taught about two human beings living together, Genesis 2:24, hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife so that they become one flesh. The first story that we are told about human beings as we know them, transcending the gender presuppositions, is that we are essentially encumbered beings. By encumbered, I'm referring to the fact that we live in relationship, we are obligated by, we are challenged by, we are responsible to, and our identity and our sense of self is created in the midst of this encumberedness. It's not a human being as a singular, alone master of the universe. It's a being in relationship. And it is precisely a failure to understand this, which is Cain's sin. When Cain kills his brother and God says, Ayeh achicha, where is your brother? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? And the essential core, first moral lesson of the Bible is, you are. Of course you are. Because the encumbered being, the story of humanity as told by our Bible, is a story of people living in a relationship, living in a family, who are responsible for each other. This family spreads and corrupts the world, and God decides to destroy the world. And when God decides to destroy the world, God doesn't see families, God sees individuals. Kishichet kol basar, all of creation is corrupt. And God decides to wipe out the whole world. But God says, Aval Noach matzachen b'nei Hashem, but Noach found favor in the eyes of God. And God tells Noach to build a ark. But even though Noach is the only one who finds favor in the eyes of God, Noach doesn't enter into the ark alone. One of the fascinating moves of the Bible, of the story that it tells you, is that once Noach is being saved, who goes into the ark together with Noach? His family. Now God, being God, could have done to Noach what God did to Abraham in 2. God could have recreated the story. But by now, to be a being is to be encumbered. For Noach to enter into the ark is for Noach to enter into the ark with his family. And it is self-evident to him that he has a sense of loyalty and responsibility to his family. And that's a core, critical part of the story. The biblical narrative then continues and says the essential feature of this being is an encumbered being in the midst of family. And now God begins to have a conversation with one particular family. And what's so interesting, before God starts to speak to that family, God tells you, I know you had an earlier family. And it tells us in Genesis 11 how Terach, Abraham has a father. And Abraham has a brother-in-law, and Abraham has a cousin, and Abraham his family had a plan. And his family is walking already to the land of Canaan, and God says, I know that's your family, but I want to create a new family. And the beginning of the Jewish story is about, within the context of encumberedness, to talk about how Jewish encumberedness changes. and how it's about creating a new family. And what's interesting about Genesis 12 is that not only is the human being encumbered, God becomes encumbered. We are mutually encumbered, and that to exist is to be in relationship to each other. But not only does it speak in the context of family as the essential building block, in many ways as the smallest building block in its discourse about humanity, it even adds another feature to that encumberdness, is that encumberdness does not merely create core loyalties and relationships. Encumberdness also puts you in the context of a story. And the book of Genesis is not a book of laws. It's a book which tells you the story of your family. And like all families, some of the chapters are good, most of the chapters are not. But it doesn't matter. Because the essential lesson of Genesis is not whether Jacob was really better than Esau. The essential lesson is this is your family. And that the way you do identity is to tell the story of your family. And it is that story which ultimately defines you. And in the midst of your encumberness, there's one law, one coherent law in the book of Genesis. And that is, as an encumbered being, as a being with a particular identity, you also have your own signs. No community could survive without its own distinguishing characteristics. And in tune with the profoundly masculine, genuine gender story, that sign is only carried on the male penis. And this is the sign of the covenant between you and eternity. I am encumbered by you, and you are a family. Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, and your nation is a family, but that family has to carry that sign. And anybody who doesn't carry that sign is kicked out of the family. And the term used for the first time, the first time in the Bible, we have the term goy beforehand. I will make of you a great. Here, you're separated from your people, and here, the core encumberness gets stretched from the family to a larger community. And that's basically the story of our exodus, first to Egypt and from Egypt. We go down as a family. But now, as the Egyptians basically say, you're not a family anymore. You're huge, you're numerous, you've multiplied. You're not a family which could somehow live in a certain neighborhood. You have another collective identity which endangers my identity, and now all of a sudden you are a people. I'm not going to use the term nation because you have to be a little, and again, for those of you who have a profound political, philosophical, or political science background, I want to just be careful. I'm not doing an anachronism of claiming that nationalism exists. Knock yourselves out. It doesn't matter. I know the nation state is the 19th, whatever. Leave it alone, put it down, write a footnote, and applaud yourself. But now we're a people. And here starts the more complicated discourse. Because we understand encumberness in the context of family. It's very, very natural. None of us assume that it is my responsibility to support every child just like I support my own. It would seem bizarre if we come into terms with our moral intuitions. It would be bizarre for us to say to our children, a child who's going to college, and we say, yes, Abba, could you help me in college? I say, I'd really love to, but your neighbor has to go to college too. And they're just, they're just not as comfortable as we are. That, again, that's not the way we do our ethics. Or if children are drowning, it's natural for us that your principal encumberness is to your children. Or children to parents. Your parents need, as again, in Michael Sandel's phenomenal book on justice. I said, what would you do? Your parents are in need. Oh, I'm going to throw dice. Should I help my parents or should I help somebody else? That's not, we're encumbered. We understand family encumberness. But it's when we now go beyond. And now we speak about a larger group. And we speak about our connections to the same level of encumberness still apply. But our tradition continues this encumberness, and the only two heroes that we hear about in the story of the Exodus are the midwives and Moses. And the midwives ignore. We don't know anything about the Jews. We don't know what they did. We don't know what they lived like. We don't know anything about them, but we know there's midwives, and we know those midwives were encumbered by their people and ignored their own self-interest and did not kill all the males. That's all we know, that now this people, here it is, this is a model. We're encumbered, I'm responsible. And what's the first thing we hear about Moses besides him floating in the river? Vayetze el Achav. Moses is a palace Jew. He's an Egyptian. And he goes out to his brothers and sisters and is obligated by them and encumbered by them. And the Bible continues this story. And the paradigm of encumberness is in the book of Numbers 32, when the tribes of Reuven, Gad, say, I don't want to go into the land of Israel. I'm a cattle person. I like cattle. I want to stay here because it's a better place. And Moses looks at them, and the rest of the Jewish people are about to go in and to begin their battle for their homeland, or what are the promised land. And in his famous statement, Moses turns and says, "Hachechem yetzu lemilchama v'atem tisharu po." Are your brothers and sisters going to go to war and you're going to stay here? And he talks to them and he says to them, in the midst of this larger collective, these tribes, you're not even a tribe. I know you have concentric circles of loyalty, but fundamentally, I'm going to apply this category of encumberness family to the larger collective. And as a Jew, you have to look at those next to you as your brothers and sisters who claim you. Because to be a Jew, to be a person, but to be a Jew is to be encumbered by them, to be bound to them. This gets translated into Jewish law and becomes the categories through which Jewish law speaks about moral responsibility. Now, the Bible in general, from Genesis 12, basically doesn't speak about non-Jews. The non-Jewish world more or less disappears. But as you're going to hear, when we're going to deal in depth with the whole question of the relationship between individualism and particularism and to what extent Jews are still connected to the world, the absence of a discourse does not mean that the world is not important. It just means that Judaism not only tells you that you're a family, not only tells you to see yourself as part of a story, it speaks about your moral responsibilities to those to whom you are encumbered. It doesn't say that you don't have other responsibilities, but it speaks to them. And one of the key terms, ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Not ahavta et ha'adam. Love your neighbor. Love your friend. Lo tisna et achicha. Don't hate your brother or sister in your heart. It speaks about your moral responsibilities to those who you are encumbered to. It speaks about yourself as part of a family. But in an absolutely remarkable move, it also says you shall love the stranger in Leviticus 18 because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall treat the stranger as one of your citizens because you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. You're not only encumbered by who you call part of your family and whether it's an imagined family, that doesn't matter. You're also encumbered by your story. Because remember, by turning to the book of Genesis, doesn't just say you have a shared origin. You have come from somewhere. Every Jew sees themselves has to see themselves as if they came out of Egypt. To be encumbered is to be encumbered by a particular history, by a particular past. You're also encumbered by that past. And that past tells you that you are a stranger in the land of Egypt, and that's why you have to love the stranger. You don't only love your neighbor, you also have to love your stranger, but for very different reasons. One is because you're encumbered because you're as a family, and one is because that's your story. And Jewish ethics becomes a play on the responsibilities that you have to those who you are encumbered by. And I brought you here tens of sources. It's for you to read. Read the story. We don't have the time to go through all of them. But it is a summary of some of the tapestry, of the way our tradition weaves the story of encumberness. And ultimately our tradition says every Jew is responsible for the other. And it tells a story of a person sitting on a boat who takes a drill and starts drilling a hole in the boat. And everybody says to him, "What are you doing?" Guy says, "What is it your problem? I'm drilling under my seat." Our tradition says that's the way you're supposed to see your people. That when one drills under their seat, it impacts everybody in the boat, and we are a people who are in the boat. This encumberness, or awareness of this encumberness, becomes a critical feature of what we require of a convert. Because here a convert is encumbered by another family. And the first thing that we demand of a convert is to ask them, why do you want to join the Jewish people? Don't you realize how persecuted they are? Don't you realize that to be a Jew is not to have a relationship with God, but principally and first and foremost, it's to be encumbered by a new community. And it's only when they say, "I know I am not worthy," do they become part of the people. Encumberness also determines in our tradition the boundaries. To be what's called in our tradition an apostate, or an apostate to the whole tradition. Maimonides says, who is such an apostate? Who is such an individual? Please open source 21, page 15. First paragraph, last 6 lines, source 21. An apostate against the whole Torah, and this is the category of the worst deviant that our tradition could imagine. An apostate against the whole Torah is a convert to the religion of the idolaters. Oh, okay. What makes you an apostate is because you convert to idolatry. But let's look what Maimonides says. Why do you convert to Maimonides? For instance, at a time when they issue arbitrary edicts, and he cleaves to them, saying, "Of what profit is there for me to cleave to Israel, who are now downtrodden and persecuted? It is rather best for me to cleave to those in whose hand lies the power." It's not the ideologue. It's the person, the essential is when I don't want to be part of the losing team. I don't want to be encumbered by the team who's suffering. It's the opposite of the convert, who says, I don't want to share their burden. And that is ultimately personified by our category of the evil child, who the minute they say, "What is this worship to you and not to me?" they are a heretic in the essence. To be encumbered, whoever goes one step further. And here, we're going to read it, and here comes the challenge. To be encumbered is to assume some level of preference. So love your neighbor as yourself. Maybe you're supposed to love others too, but I'm talking to you about morality in the context of the community in which you live, because that's how I see you. I'm talking to you now. But what happens when there are multiple people who are your neighbors? What happens when your neighbors aren't just Jews? Is it East Jerusalem? Is it West Jerusalem? What is it, 20% Arab citizens of Israeli society? What is it? Is it people of different politics? Is it a different state? How do I see my moral responsibility for encumberness? Please turn to page 22. The Babylonian Talmud, and here we're touching the essence of the challenge. Encumberedness does create, by definition, prioritization. But the question is, where should that prioritization be? Under Jewish law, if it is a choice between my people and an idolater, my people has preference. The poor or the rich? That's easy. The poor takes precedence. The poor who's your family, or the poor in general, or the poor of your, who? The poor of your family. Your poor comes first. The poor of your city or the poor of some other city? The poor of your own town. There are some prioritizations which seem natural. Before you do tikkun olam, fix your neighborhood. If someone's hungry in your family, they come first. But how do we feel when we're not merely talking about geographical proximity? Now we're talking about us and them, and is there an us-them between Jew and non-Jew? And is there a difference between an us-them when we are powerless and living in the ghetto and all of the thems are outside of the ghetto, between an us-them when part of the them are us? Because that's what it means to be an Israeli, and part of an us is to be an American or a Canadian or a Mexican, or to be a part of a society with people with different. Who's your us? And does your encumberness begin to create moral distinctions that are profoundly immoral? Or when we transcend that boundary, as it says on page 25, even though you're supposed to support your poor first, the idolatrous poor are not prevented from gathering gleanings, forgotten sheaves, the corners of the field to avoid ill feelings. Our rabbis have taught we support the poor of the heathen along with the poor of Israel, and visit the sick of the heathen along with the sick of Israel, and bury the poor of the heathen along with the dead of Israel in the interests of peace. Okay, I have concentric circles of responsibility. It's not just my family. I care for others, but when I care for them for the sake of peace, why am I caring for them? Is that just, again, looking out for myself? Is it just another way for me to do encumbered ethics? So I could expand it, but I only expand it when it relates to me. We are told a story of encumberness, and we end that story with a question of what is the moral baggage of encumberness. But now I want to tell another story. I want to tell a different story, which now asks, as encumbered beings, as members of a people, how do you define the purpose of your life? How do you decide what is the good? How do you decide to make the decisions that you're about to make? What is it that you think about? And here again, and I know it's a lot, but I want this to be with you as you think throughout this seminar. Our tradition begins to tell a very, very complicated and surprising story, which I believe has significant impact on the way we think about Jewish peoplehood, and the way we think about Zionism, and the way we think about Israel, and the way we think about ourselves as community beings. One of the surprising things about the Jewish tradition is that it is a profoundly utilitarian, hedonistic tradition in the Bible. It's very strange. Utilitarianism, as Bentham discusses and posits, it's about the maximizing of happiness for the maximum number of people. And that the good involves a very serious, what creates the greatest amount of happiness? But happiness in our tradition begins, and the 5 books of Moses and most of the Bible, with the exception of a few prophets, the fundamental definition of happiness is physical happiness. The happiness we pursue is life, well-being, food, safety, and comfort. This utilitarian, in many ways, physical happiness is personified by a place that ultimately casts a shadow on the whole Bible. Do any of you know what that place is? Anybody want to take a chance? Gan Eden. Love you. It's the Garden of Eden. What's the Garden of Eden? Were there yeshivas in the Garden of Eden? Were there teachers there? Was it a university? Was it a library? What's the Garden of Eden? What defines the Garden of Eden? In the Garden of Eden, everything that you could look, everything was beautiful physically and beautiful for taste. In the Garden of Eden, you had everything. When you get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, the punishment is that everything that's essential to human nature becomes difficult to you. The perpetuation of your species is now done with pain. The acquisition of the food that you need will always be difficult for you. But in the Garden of Eden, you had everything. Now, the Garden of Eden is not a place that exists only in Genesis 2, somewhere in Mesopotamia between 4 rivers, which somehow we have to discover and we'll find our way back. The Garden of Eden begins to define the paradigm of the type of life that we want to live in as a people. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, while living outside of the Garden of Eden, essentially live in a bubble in which everything that they want and everything that they need is provided for them. They live in complete and total safety. But it gets even more significant when we begin to speak about our people. God in Exodus turns to the Jewish people and says, I'm going to take you out of Egypt where? Where am I going to take you? To the promised land. But what is the promised land? It's a land of milk and honey. It's beautiful. There's a land of bounty. And the spies who go, oh, this is the most, I don't know what land they went to. But in any event, let's say, I don't know, it changed a little bit. But this is a land, what is the characteristics of Israel? Israel is basically the Garden of Eden. And as the Bible tells the story of our journeys in the desert becomes the Garden of Eden. And the Bible speaks in Deuteronomy that you didn't want anything. You didn't have any needs. Your clothing didn't wear out. You never lacked for food. Everything that you needed. So now it's not on a tree. It comes down from heaven. But basically the existence is I am going to keep you in this garden. And I'm going to now move you into the next garden, which will be your destiny forever. So the Garden of Eden is not something that in our biblical tradition human beings left. It is actually, and I'll come back to this in a moment, the place that you could reacquire. And the Garden of Eden is not just something which speaks about the past, it also defines our Messianic era. What's going to be in the Garden of Eden? All Jews will be back home. We're going to live in safety and protection. But even more than that, the rabbis speak about the fact that in the Garden of Eden, in the world to come, you're going to have babies every day. Oy. The trees are going to produce loaves of bread and cakes. It is remarkable how within a religious tradition, the notion of happiness is profoundly physical. In the Bible, it's physical, political, it has to do with life, happiness in the physical sense, well-being, prosperity, dealing with your core instinct. And here the Bible is speaking to human beings. In many ways it says, if you have a body, I know you're created in the image of God, but as beings with bodies, I have to speak to your body. And redemption is the physical redemption of your body. And it doesn't ask you to transcend your body. And it's not a tradition which says transcend it in the worship of God, not at all. It does the opposite move. It actually connects God to this physical utilitarian vision. And so the first definition of the telos, the purpose, the goal of our people is to create or to live in a space where we will be able to create either on our own or with the will of God a Garden of Eden in which we could prosper physically and be safe and be well. The second stage, however, of this story is planted already from the outset. one of the remarkable things of the Bible is that it links this physical redemption, this physical notion of happiness, that's who you want to be, it links it to obeying the will of God. Our religious tradition doesn't change the definition of happiness, but it associates that happiness with a religious life. And in doing so begins a new chapter. One way of looking at it, as many did, and this upset Maimonides to no end, is that the end is happiness and Torah, the observance of Torah, is a means. And the one who understood this, by the way, for those of you who want to do a little more research, is the Satan in the book of Job. He understood this profound irony. When he says, God, of course he's righteous. Why would you not be righteous? You set up the story. That if you what? If you gave him everything, why shouldn't he be righteous? You think he cares for you? He doesn't give a about you. Take away from him all of the rewards and let's see what he's going to do. That was the flaw. The core flaw of the Bible is that God wanted human beings so much to worship God that God was willing to sell the worship of God and turn it into a means in which the end was happiness. That's one core part of the story. But as we begin the second chapter, the fact that they're related to each other opens up a new possibility. A possibility to expand the definition of happiness. Aristotle describes happiness as acting in a rational way. In our tradition, happiness, by associating the worship of God and the fulfillment of commandments with the reward of happiness, it begins to add within the calculation of the purpose of life, not merely the maximization of physical happiness, but possibly the maximization of happiness of a higher form. And we see this in a number of the prophets who speak about the end of days not merely as physical, but speak about the Isaiah in chapter 11 speaks about at the end of days, the knowledge of God. The world will be filled with the knowledge of God. And in Isaiah 2, that in the end of days, all the nations of the world will stream to Jerusalem and say, I want to be close to the house of the Mount of God. Once worship of God is brought into the story, it could possibly begin to expand the category of happiness. And Maimonides, as he looks back at the Bible, he says we have to distinguish between those who worship out of fear and those who worship out of love. Those who worship out of fear fulfill the law as a means to an end of physical happiness. Those who worship God out of love understand that the true telos of life, the true value of life, is when you begin to live in accordance with these commandments and you do them for their own sake. And now, in part 2 of this story, maybe we are looking for the maximizing of happiness, but what constitutes that happiness? What does it mean? Does it mean just a physical? Or is there something else that we're looking for? Is it a certain spirit? Is it a system of values? And that the happy person maybe is the virtuous person. The happy person is the person who has a life of meaning and value. But now we come to the third part of the story, and towards the end of my remarks. I didn't say the end, I said towards the end. Being ADHD, I find it valuable to just warn people what's to come, so you can position your tush accordingly. On page 43, Maimonides states, not 43. On page 47, Whoever is ambitious to establish this commandment of fulfilling the obligation to study Torah properly and to become adorned with the crown of Torah, must not divert his thoughts to other matters, nor set his heart to acquire the knowledge of Torah and wealth and honor simultaneously. The way leading to the knowledge of Torah is such: a morsel of bread with salt shall you eat, and water with measure shalt thou drink, and upon the ground thou shalt you sleep, and a burdensome life shall you live, while you toils in Torah. Maybe a person shall say, I will interrupt my study of Torah until I will accumulate wealth, and then I'll return to it. Or I will acquire sufficient substance to supply my needs, and then I'll retire and come back. If such a thought penetrates your heart, you will never acquire the crown of Torah. It is not in heaven, nor is it beyond thee. Maimonides says it's not in heaven. That is to say, the Torah is not found amongst the arrogant, nor is it found amongst the travelers of the seas. Nor is he who engages himself over too much in commerce is wise. The words of Torah are likened to water, as it says, Ho, everyone that is thirsty, come to the water, which is to teach you that even as water does not gather in steep places, but flows by gravity and gathers in the well, so are the words of the Torah. They're not to be found amongst the high-spirited, nor in the heart of the haughty, but in the humble and the meek spirit who embrace the dust of the feet. The words of Torah do not remain permanently with one who is indolent or acquiring them, nor with such who studies the Torah in the environment of luxury amidst eating and drinking. Maimonides says the crown of Torah can never be associated with happiness, and that the value of life is not determined solely within the category of happiness. And that to be a Jew and to fulfill the ultimate goal of a Jew and of our people is maybe to reject the fundamental biblical story which yearns for a return to the Garden of Eden. And in a beautiful rabbinic move, the rabbis on page 45 state, it was taught, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, the Holy One, blessed He, gave Israel 3 precious gifts, and all of them were given only through suffering. In a post-biblical world, I can't speak about the telos of Jewish peoplehood as the pursuit of happiness, because that's not my life. I'm not living a happy life. This is not joyful. If I want to be happy, I'm going to Rome. I'm not staying in Jerusalem, and I know Pumbedita is phenomenal, but still. And they're looking and saying, is really the Garden of Eden the model? And what's so paradoxical is even the world to come, the so-called garden, everything that is of value, everything that our tradition wants you to be, the rabbis say, it was given with suffering and pain. And the rabbis are now asking and looking to the Jewish people and saying, is the telos of the Jewish people the maximization of happiness? Or do we understand that to live a life of value is possibly to recognize that suffering is okay? That suffering for a purpose is okay? The question is, I'm not making suffering an ideal unto itself, but for what? And as Ecclesiastes says at the end, the sum of the matter when all is said and done, revere God and observe God's commandments. Ki zeh kol ha'adam. This is the essence of what it means to be a human being. And in possibly the greatest rejection of the pursuit of happiness appears in Maimonides. On the last page, page 51. If idolaters, one of the classic examples of utilitarianism is told, and it's referred to as the trolley story or the trolley case. And there's multiple versions of the trolley case, and I'll tell you one of them. One version is that you're sitting in a trolley, you're driver of a trolley, and there's 20, 30 people in that trolley, and you're going along a track, and all of a sudden you discover that your brake doesn't work. And if you continue along that track, the track is coming to an end, and either you're going to fall off the track or you're going to crash and everybody's going to die. But you're the driver of the trolley. What do? Because there's an option. There's a juncture. And if you move the switch, you're going to have much more track, and you'll be able to slowly slow down, and everybody will live. But there's just one little problem. There's a car on that track. And you're going to have to kill one person. Are you going to save 20 people and let one person die? What are you going to do? By the way, this is also one of the challenges of what do you program automatic cars? What moral decision are they going to make? And how do you do that? But utilitarianism says it's very simple. If my task is to maximize the amount of happiness for the maximum amount of people, I know life is a bitch, excuse my French, but what could you do? Sometimes you have to make those decisions. You have to make priorities, have to maximize happiness. The story of my tradition tells me as follows in Jewish law. If idolaters will demand one of a group of women saying, "Yield to us one amongst you, and we will defile her. If not, we will defile you all," utilitarianism says it is no issue. But Jewish law says that all be defiled, rather than surrender to them one soul of Israel. Likewise, if idolaters say to a group of men, "Yield to us one of you, and we will kill him. If not, we will kill all of you," let all of them be killed, rather than surrender to them one soul in Israel. That to be a Jew is to recognize that life is not just the maximization of happiness. That a Jewish people have to be a people who stand for value. And sometimes that means to recognize that suffering is going to be part of your destiny. And this is ultimately what defines the Israeli military code of ethic. When it says that when you use your weapons, you will only use it in proportion to the danger you face, and even more than that, you will do everything in your power to avoid casualties to civilians or to prisoners of war. That means that to fight in the Israeli army, to use your power, is also to recognize that there are times when we're going to have to die. And at the end of the day, the telos of our army is not that everybody comes home, but that we stand for things that we stand for. I am an encumbered being. I only know how to see myself as an encumbered being. The challenge is not purely to be encumbered or unencumbered. The challenge is also who encumbers me. And to recognize that who I am encumbered by is a choice. But our tradition tells you that from Abraham you have been encumbered by a people who claim you. But how am I encumbered also by others? And to what extent do I become encumbered by others? What guides my decisions? What does it mean to be a people? What is the purpose of Jewish peoplehood? How do we think about the value and challenges of nationalism? I would suggest that this three-pronged story challenges us to not make an either-or decision. And as anybody who's ever studied with anybody at the Hartman Institute knows, that whenever someone asks you, in Judaism, is it A or B? The answer is only yes. And here it is, a three-pronged story. Part of the story tells you that to be a people, that the Jewish people are a people who embrace the physical, that there are people who care about happiness and well-being and long life and security, and that's legitimate. That's what it means. Your life takes precedent. That's healthy. And that any discourse about the value of human life which doesn't respect the physicality of our being is missing something essential. And as all of you know, if you did some of the reading, part of the whole increase of nationalism is a result of individuals who get up and say, does my country care about me? What about maximizing my happiness? Is somehow my needs and challenge, do you care about it? And only when you feel safe that they care about it is something that I could be embraced. And it is the nationalist instinct which says, I see you and care about you. And I'm not talking about your higher self alone. I'm talking about your need for a living, for wages, for care. And what's remarkable about a religious tradition such as Judaism is it is so profoundly physical, and in so doing creates a prioritization and a legitimization of a people caring about happiness in the most simple and basic way. And you can't understand Zionism unless you connect to that dimension of Judaism. It's about Jews being safe. It is also about Startup Nation. It's about building. It's about the physical. We came home not to be minds. We were minds in the diaspora. The Zionist says, I don't want to be a mind. Give me back my body. And Israel says, you have your body, and I'm going to care for it. And part of being a Jew is to recognize that significance. I don't want to be overly dramatic, but it is also one of the fundamental Torahs of Auschwitz. We don't yearn to be a dying noble people. And part of the reasons why, and I know you're going to get upset, but don't be upset because it's within a certain context that I'm saying this. That's part of the reason, and this is part of my father's Torah, that I don't feel a profound need that everybody has to go to Yad Vashem and love me by feeling that I'm some pathetic something. I'm not a pathetic. I don't want to be pathetic. I am here. I am strong. I have a body, and you better believe that I'm going to care for that body. And in doing so, I am embodying an essential lesson of my Jewish tradition. To be a religious being is to care for the physical, not to simply transcend it. I'm not a Buddhist. I don't believe that shunyata is rupa and rupa shunyata, that everything is only when you understand that everything is nothingness and nothing is everything. Jewish tradition says no. Physical happiness counts. And I stand here connected to that. But I also have to understand that happiness is not only physical happiness. And I have to ask myself, what are the values of my story? And that I define happiness in terms of ways in which I can maximize my culture, ways in which I can maximize my values, ways in which I could live a Jewish life. And in living a Jewish life, I feel the joys of Judaism and its happiness. And part of my national aspiration is not merely to give us more. It's not who has more at the end wins, who has more money, who has a bigger house. But part of happiness is to live a life of value and to stand for it. And to recognize that as a people, especially when we look at the concentric circles of encumberment, that part of my challenges is also to ask myself, what am I encumbered by? When I love the stranger, I'm encumbered by my story. And that I have to be encumbered by those values and that story. But the third feature of being a Jew is also to understand that happiness is also or can be overrated when it is all that you have. And that to be a Jew is also to be willing to choose death. And that a human life, whether individual or on a societal level, in which the preservation of physical happiness alone is all that inspires you, then you become idolatrous. And that's true. Part of the way I determine who I ought to be are what are my values. And so maybe I don't want to be encumbered by them. I want more. Give me more. Why should I give to the Arabs? Why should I care about this group or that group? Why should I give? I want more. And maybe the more you want more, the less you are. As in everything, is it A, B, or C? The answer is yes. And the challenge, which I want to share with you, and it's a journey. I don't know. I know I am a nationalist. I know it's a frame which gives expression to my being encumbered. And I don't pick it because I believe it's better than globalism. I'm just aware of the fact that that's who I am. And in my moral universe, I do give preference. But there's a very big difference between preference to discrimination. I will give preference, but at times I won't. And at times I'm going to say no. At times to be a Jew, to be an Israeli, to be a part of this people, is to pick your values over happiness. How to do that? How to balance it? What's the Shulchan Aruch? What's the exact measure? There is none. But the journey of our people is a journey of encumberdness in search of meaning. Whether that search of meaning will be a gift, whether that search of meaning will be a force for good, will depend on how we balance these 3 chapters of our story. In many ways, it'll be about how we take our 2 stories and how we merge them together into a story of encumberdness of value. Encumberdness connected to the world, connected to my body, connected to my values, and recognizing that a human life is determined by the maximization of happiness, but not only by the maximization of happiness. How we tell that story, how we translate that into policy. What's our policy in Judea and Samaria? What's our policy towards Israeli Arabs? What's our policies towards refugees? What's our policies between our different tribes? That's the story. But it's telling that story and working it out, which is ultimately the challenge of nationalism, the challenge of Zionism, and the challenge of our people. Welcome, and thank you very, very much. And now we have a few minutes for what I'm going to do is I'll take, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take some, and I'll take them together and then respond afterwards. If any questions, since we don't have a lot of time, we'll leave comments for later. Any questions, please? Yes, please, sir. We're going to finish at, as it says in your schedule, I believe, 7:15? No, it says 7:15. If you look at the schedule, we adjusted it. I knew how long the lecture would be. One of the great advantages of being president of the Shalom Hartman Institute is that my lectures are never too long. And it's not about maximizing happiness. We're just going to take 2 or 3 questions, see if you have them, and then we're going to go for dinner. Yes, please, sir. Just a little louder, and I'll repeat it, please. Yes.
You said the convert becomes a Jew when he
The convert.
becomes a Jew when he or she affirms that she is unequal.
No. I said that a person becomes a convert when he or she accepts that they are encumbered. And the story is, it says, why do you want to become a Jew? Don't you know that the Jewish people are suffering and despised and attacked? And it is only when he says, I know and I am unworthy, that he is accepted forthwith. So you heard part of it. It's correct. When he accepts upon themselves the encumberness of the Jewish people.
He says, what does it mean to be unworthy?
Yeah, it's just he's embracing it with humility. It's just it's a term of saying, I embrace it wholeheartedly. Yes, please.
Maybe a semantic question, maybe more. Do you see any distinction between patriotism and nationalism?
Great question. Do I see any difference with distinctions between patriotism and nationalism? One of the things that you have to look at is that very often, and you'll see this in Chazoni and in other people, we tend to pick the words that are associated with what we think is positive. So patriotism is positive, nationalism. So your question, it's a semantic question, but it's a great question for us because the answer, I don't care. It's how you use your categories. But at the end, don't worry about the terms. In other words, I could come up with a definition, of course. Now, patriotism and nationalism are intimately connected to each other. But some people, patriotism is positive, but nationalism is negative. Fair, knock yourself out. Then I'll call nationalism your patriotism. You understand what I mean? The essential question is, what do you mean by it? How do you talk about your sense of being encumbered, your loyalty, your sense of connection? How do you spell out prioritization? Now, patriotism, which speaks to the fact that I fight, that I'm willing to sacrifice for my country, demands a more complex notion. There's loyalty, etc. I'm willing to fight for my country. I'm willing to die for it. That's one of the ultimate expressions of prioritization. But does that mean that because I prioritize my people, I'm willing to kill anybody at any time for any reasons? That's where it becomes fascism, or not. So we could spend all of our time arguing about the categories. That's why I just gave you some. But ask yourself not the category, but what is it that you mean? And then if at the end of the day, patriotism is not nationalism, but it's something else, but it speaks about your loyalty to your group, and you're willing to care for their interests and give priority to their identity, et cetera, then be a patriotist and not a nationalist, and we're good. You understand what I mean? Yes. So it doesn't, and part because we have such different categories, and because each one of these categories is, there's literally, I've been reading for a year in preparation of this summer. It's like it's been a year's of work, not just of mine, but of a whole team of people at the Institute. You know, we picked this theme because it was a good idea, not realizing how much work we're going to have to do. Interesting. We'll do Be Smarter next year. But it was a remarkable year. And part of what you realize is that there is so much semanticization or semantification of the discourse which obfuscates a lot of the essential features. So your point is such a blessing right now because it puts the whole issue of semantics in front of us. And since we're not a graduate seminar, and since none of us are writing our PhD right now on this topic, we don't have to worry about the footnoting. So it's what you mean by it. But very often, patriotism is used as the positive nationalism, as distinct from the more negative. Yes, please, ma'am.
So words are very important, and when trying to come to grips with one's own feelings amongst a group of friends, I said, well, I am a Zionist. Quiet,
There was quiet in the room, yeah.
yes, it was like pass the milk.
Right.
And I did it knowing I was stepping my foot into a very dangerous
This-
fire.
right.
But I wanted to see if friendship trumped that word. Truly a wrong word. But if friendship would transcend that. I think it did,
But you're not sure. It was very, very scary. You're right that words matter, and part of the space that I'm asking us to talk, it's true. That's why from the outset I said I'm a nationalist. I also once at a certain program at the Hartman Institute said I'm a Zionist. And one of the research fellows said to me, excuse me, could you not use that term? Because whenever you use that term, I feel you're justifying the occupation. I said to them, that's not my intentions, but I know I feel that way. So I said, what term would you rather I use? She says, why don't you speak about, instead of saying Zionism, why don't you speak about the perception that Jewish people have a homeland and that we have a right to be sovereign within our homeland, within the country. I said, that's a real catchy term. I said, you know why I use the term? I said, that's the way. Now, part of what it means to be a Jew is to take categories and to reinterpret them. Otherwise, I forget that song. I know it in Hebrew. Akova sheli, shalosh pinot, lakova sheli. And then, like if the end of the word, there's all these words, we're going to go around, I have no words. No, part of what we do at Hartman, and part of our challenge is to reclaim the terms. And to say, okay, by Zionism, do I mean that I reject the rights of Arabs? By Zionism, does it mean that I don't care about Palestinians? And I'm not going to get into politics right now. Is that what it means? Part of our challenge of this week, as I said to you at the beginning in the introduction, is to take these categories and to own them and to reinterpret them and to know that some of our people are going to be challenged by them, but part of it is to create a discussion. So you know what? You call it A, I call it B, but what do we mean? Creating a shared value language could sometimes mean that we use different words, but that means we also have to recognize that we don't get triggerized all the time by someone else's words, but we try to listen to the values behind those words. And so I hope your friends stayed. Here at the Hartman Institute, there's a lot of different people here with different politics and different ages and different sensibilities. Don't let yourself be triggerized. When a person uses a word, ask them, what are they meaning? And the fact that other people associate it that way, is that necessary? Is it essential? Or could we elevate our conversation? All of Judaism is about taking the written word and reinterpreting it to the extent that we even know that Moses doesn't even understand the word anymore. Moses doesn't understand what we say Moses told us, because the word is the beginning, but it is our interpretation of the words that ultimately define us. Yes, please, sir.
In your formulation, are universalists encumbered with different loyalties?
Absolutely. Great question. And again, there's different forms of universalism and globalism, but part of the question that I asked is that I'm an encumbered being, but I'm only encumbered exclusively by my family, or do I have other levels of encumberment? And how do those levels of encumberment play themselves out in my tradition? Do I only love them? Do I only care about those in this second cycle of encumberness if it's for the pursuit of peace, Darkei Shalom? Or, quoting the Maimonides, in that same text, I am encumbered by non-Jews and I have to feed them and care for them because of paths of peace, because Torah is a religion of peace. And all of a sudden, paths of peace stops being a utilitarian version, but it becomes a core value of who it is that I am. So yes, I could be encumbered. So globalism, there are different forms of globalism. Universalism, some of them argue that it's just human being qua human being. But I am encumbered, but I'm encumbered by every single individual human being, regardless of national, race, gender, whatever. I am encumbered and obligated, and all the other distinctions are arbitrary. More often than not, however, globalism speaks to new levels and different levels of encumberedness. in which I am encumbered not by those who are members of my nation state, but I'm encumbered by those who are in my socioeconomic group, a cultural group, a gender, different. Maybe it's the oppressed. There are cases where I can imagine that there is no more, that I am just not encumbered by anything, but I am only dominated by a Kantian principle of moral responsibility to act in such a way that all human beings are never treated as an end, and that I act in such a way that all my behavior should be universalizable, and so whoever I see and wherever I go, it just doesn't. I'm not encumbered. I'm encumbered only by a rational truth that defines me and obligates me. There is a version of that. More often than not, it is just saying that the nation, the national group, is an arbitrary encumberness, and I have other ones. And then comes the serious challenge: is that really so? Is the only encumberness that you reject an encumberness by Israel? Are you encumbered? Do you accept that we have concentric circles of encumberness? Now there too, I could be encumbered by multiple. It doesn't mean that every time, and in which case, what do I do? When I go to war, what do I do? I know I'm encumbered by Jews, but I know that I'm also encumbered. And I am also encumbered by humanity qua humanity. I'm encumbered by my neighbors. I'm encumbered by people who live in my midst. And so very often the challenge, and that's why I'm not resolving, nationalism could be profoundly corrupt. Nationalism can create fascism. I'm not belittling that potential. It is how we balance the three. When is it that I say, yes, I need to be encumbered by you because that's my values? And when do I say, I don't care who I'm encumbered by? Happiness is not the only value. And so it is not between encumberness to not encumberness. It's very often between what are the spheres of those encumberness and how do they get resolved. And at the end of the day, the answer is not about picking ketchup, what's the right answer. It's about, as Michael Sandel does in his work, it's about trying to tell stories that enable us to come to terms with the limits and boundaries of our moral intuitions. And that to be a moral human being is never to choose between the right and the wrong, but is to try to struggle about what are the parameters of the right. And your question about the extent and nature of this encumberness and is precisely the type of story, the mess. And sometimes we don't even want this, and that's why maybe sometimes we become individualists, because I don't even, this myth that I am, but I just like myself better that way. It's just life is so much simpler. I don't want to it's not who wants to be a man? I want to be a nice person. But what are the stories we tell, and how do we play it out? And so thank you for that question. Yes, please, sir.
What if the loyalties are not essential, but they're key to like nationalist loyalties?
Beautiful. That's again, part of it. It's a great, great question. I have a great answer, but I don't want to limit it by the question. Okay, I'll limit it by the question. What happens when you have dual loyalties? Multiple encumberments at the same time. In fact, this is going to be a part of our new I Engage. One of the chapters is going to be on issues of dual loyalty. We Jews get very sensitive to this issue of dual loyalty. Somehow it goes back to these old anti-Semitic tropes that we're never to be trusted. And that somehow, where is your core loyalty? Are you more loyal to America, or what do you do? And that somehow my loyalty to the Jewish people is an anti-American story, because to be truly, okay, I'm willing to be a nationalist, but America is my primary national. That's really what calls me. And so Ed Koch tried to resolve it by saying, there's no problem. When Israel attacks America, I'll defend America. So he was flip about it, but does that really solve the problem? What is it about dual loyalty when, in fact, this whole discourse is foreign to how we in fact see ourselves? And it's a perfect example of a conceptual analysis which is alienated or disconnected from the stories that we tell. I wish there was a human being, forget a Jew, who has dual loyalty. Everybody has 15 loyalties. An American citizen, you have loyalty to your country, but you also have loyalty to your family. That's a dual loyalty. You have a loyalty to your state and a loyalty to your country. You have loyalty to your gender. You have loyalty to those who are pursuing a certain cultural agenda. You have loyalties to the place that you were born. Part of the anti-Semitic trope is that it's Jews who have dual loyalties. This is the lie, and we defend ourselves in the wrong manner by saying, no, we're not. Here it is. You said I have dual loyalty. No, I have no dual loyalty. That's the answer? The answer is, of course I have dual loyalty. I actually have 8 loyalties, and so do you. Let's talk about who we are as human beings. Nobody has a singular loyalty. Everybody comes from somewhere. Whether I'm Jewish, whether I'm Irish, whether I'm Greek, whether I'm Christian. When I'm a Christian, separation is all that's nice and done, but when I make decisions about abortion and life, etc., am I making them only on the basis of what's good for America, or am I basing it on other loyalties? Now, of course I am. Everybody does. So we answer, and then somehow our complex identities become unacceptable. When instead we have to, as people, take this literally anti-Semitic attack as if we're the only ones who are somehow disloyal, as if somehow the only lobby that's not acceptable is AIPAC. Like, that's okay, NRA, that's for America, that's it? Like, this is somehow you are the traitor, that this is just unacceptable? We all have them. And the story of moral life and the story of political life is, how do we balance these multiple loyalties? When do we use one? When are the limits of them? And they're not simple. When is the time? When, in the Vietnam War, when is it that your loyalty, your triple, quadruple loyalties require of you to protest? When do they require of you to say no? When do they require of you to turn your back? What are the limits of demonstration? We as human beings live in continuous concentric circles of encumberness. And to be a human being is to find a way to balance them. And nobody has an answer. But it's when you assume that patriotism is to become the unencumbered one, then you're putting Jews in a box in which the future of our relationship to Israel, and in many ways I would argue the future of our Jewish identity, is profoundly impaired. Let's embrace our encumberdness. It's not about rejecting it, it's embracing it, and then asking ourselves, what's the challenge and what is the challenges that it entails, and how do we elevate it? And how do we make the difficult moral decisions that every one of us makes all the time? Welcome to humanity. Humanity is not about knowing the singular true, moral, necessary path. It's a mess. It's a journey. But that journey is the journey of life, and it's a journey of meaning. And we Jews have to embrace it with pride. This is our encumberness. It's no worse and no better. And our responsibility is to make sure that it's better. What constitutes better? Go and study. Thank you all very, very much.